I almost forgot. Okay, there we go. I'm with the Brain Center for Community Engagement. My colleague Julie Robinson is here. You'll hear from her at the end of the session. So thank you so much. This is our second session that we've hosted in our spring series. So for those of you that have been a part of this since the beginning, you know that the series was created in the wake of a disturbing summer of violence and police brutality, which has sparked renewed momentum for the ongoing movement for racial justice in this country, in our community, and on this campus. And over the course of the past 8 months, we've continued to create this space to bring people together for conversation and learning around these very important topics. So everyone will remain muted during the course of the session, and the session will be recorded, so you can go back and revisit any of the resources that you hear about. It'll be posted on our Brain Center YouTube channel. And just a reminder that this event is rooted in the expectations established in BW's community standards of conduct. So we expect that this is a space where we can engage empathetically, respectfully, and thoughtfully together. So our spring series began last week with Dr. Jason Kyber, who introduced us to an exploration of another threat facing our campus, our community, and our country, which is white supremacy and domestic terrorism. So tonight we're going to continue this examination through the lens of social media. And I'm thrilled to introduce our co-hosts for tonight. We have Dr. Lauren Copeland, who is an assistant professor in politics and global citizenship, also the associate director of the Community Research Institute, and I think about 100 other things too. We could probably add to that list. Dr. Copeland is a self-described politics and data science nerd with research activities looking at the intersections of political communication, political behavior, and public opinion. And a really exciting current focus on digital media use and political participation, which we will be tapping into tonight. Our other co-host is Dr. Brian Monahan, who is an associate professor in sociology and criminal justice. Brian's research interests include media and crime, social construction of social problems, crime rhetoric, criminology, and qualitative methods. And we're excited to hear more about what he's been working on as well. So I am going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Copeland. Lauren, you should be able to share your screen.
Oops. Present. All right, so the title of our, thanks for having me first of all, and thanks for coming. Our talk is Social Media in the Age of Misinformation and Disinformation Campaigns. And I am going to provide some of the broad strokes, and then Brian is going to provide a specific example of misinformation and disinformation campaigns via former President Trump. So I'm going to talk about social media use for political information and caveats. Then Brian will talk, and then concluding thoughts. So the short story is that fewer and fewer people are getting their news from traditional media outlets, and more people are getting their news from social media and news websites. And this is somewhat problematic because unlike traditional newspapers or even online newspapers, there aren't any gatekeepers on social media. So Twitter and Facebook might monitor misinformation that gets spread around, but not to the extent that seasoned journalists would do so. And what this allows for is for the misinformation and disinformation to spread very, very quickly. Currently, YouTube and Facebook of the social media news sources are the #1 sources for news, followed by Instagram and some other things here. Also, 12% of people are getting their news on Twitter. They're getting their news on Insta, LinkedIn, Reddit, Snapchat, WhatsApp, and Tumblr. And I'm going to talk about why some of this might be good, but also might be quite bad. So on the positive side, social media creates opportunities for incidental exposure to political information. So the benefit here is that people who might not follow the news closely could be exposed to the news if their friends or family members share information, of course, so long as it's credible. And candidates can also reach people directly through social media. So the idea here is that social media can be somewhat of a democratizing force, with more people getting informed about politics because their friends and family members are sharing information, assuming, again, it's credible. So this is good because if you're exposed to political information through social media, then studies show that you're more likely to engage in political participation. And social media also facilitates wide-scale collective action. So we saw this in 2020 with the Black Lives Matter campaign. Most of that was organized online, and we saw the impact that it had offline. So what social media allow is they create an infrastructure that formal organizations used to have to provide, but now people can access and upload videos and content very quickly and connect with one another almost seamlessly. So here's an example of how social media can mobilize people to participate in politics. So this is somewhat of an unethical study, in my opinion, but Facebook teamed up with researchers at the University of California, San Diego, and during the 2010 midterm elections, they essentially put 61 million Facebook users in one of three experimental conditions. One was just an informational condition that the election was coming up and that you should vote. Another one said that the election's coming up and you should vote, and also your friends have voted and here's their pictures. And then the third one, people received no messages. And they found that people who received the social message, so the one that included whose friends had participated, those people were much more likely to vote in the election. We've also seen many campaigns. I guess this is getting a little bit dated, but social media facilitated the ALS Ice Bucket Challenge, Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, also the Arab Spring, the Me Too movement, and the Ferguson protests in Missouri. So I would argue that those are good things. The problem is there's threefold, arguably. So first, most social networks are homogenous, meaning that people are not exposed to diverse points of view. People tend to be friends with people who share similar views. So liberals tend to be friends with liberals, and conservative people tend to be friends with conservatives. And what this means is that you're essentially in an echo chamber when you're in social media, and you're only exposed to information with which you agree and not information with which you disagree. I see this in my Facebook feed a lot, for example, where if you're racist, I'm unfriending you, or if you keep sharing this racist stuff, I'm unfriending you. And I know a lot of unfriending, there's been studies that show a lot of unfriending happens right after elections. There's also algorithmic filtering. So this makes, basically the idea here is Facebook identifies whether you are a liberal or a conservative or a moderate, and it tends to show you information with which you agree and you don't even know it. So the Wall Street Journal has this blue feed, red feed, which is really cool to look at. It's been frozen in time. But you can look at what a liberal's newsfeed looks like versus a conservative's, and it's like they're in two completely different worlds. And it's no wonder that our politics have become so polarized that we can't even agree on the facts, because people are being exposed to two different universes of information, and there's a clear partisan bias to this information. And then the third thing, and this is what Brian's going to talk about in more detail, is that social media provides ideal platforms for spreading fake news or propaganda or misinformation and disinformation. So when I gave an extended talk on this in the past at Case Western, I talked about how the IRA in Russia, how they spread misinformation during the 2016 presidential campaign. But even though they had bots set up to spread misinformation, it wasn't the bots that spread misinformation so much as people who spread what the bots were saying. So humans are more culpable than any automated account that other people can create. It's also easy to establish fake accounts on Twitter and Facebook, although they keep trying to make it harder and harder. And like I said, because there aren't gatekeepers or editorial control, it's really easy to deliver messages that are misleading or false. So Brian now is going to talk about the construction of false narratives, based on a study that he's been working on a long time and that finally got published in a journal.
And while, oh, perfect. While you get your slides pulled up there, if anybody has questions, we will have time for discussion. So feel free to put them in the chat as we go, and we can address them at the end.
We're good, we can see?
Yep, looks great.
All right, thank you. So what I'm going to do here is, as Lauren said, this is from a study that just was published, let's see, where are we, March 2nd. So mid-January, it just came out. So it's as far as academic studies go, it's hot off the press. But it's a lot of time to go through this. So I'm going to kind of lay out the study, and I want to connect it briefly just to let you know how it connects to the larger body of things I study, because this really wasn't intended entirely to be about Trump. I think there's interesting processes and structures here that we can move beyond Trump, and I think that's important. Then I'll go over the study a little bit to show what we found and really understand how this misinformation can be structured in a way that, while it doesn't hold up to critical scrutiny, it's so believable to so many. And part of that comes from the rhetorical structure and the delivery. So I'm hoping to unpack some of that. And then we can connect it back to some of Lauren's ideas and whatever Q&A we have in the future considerations. So the first thing here is I have a colleague at GW that I worked with, so I wanted to give him credit. And then the other thing is, when I do research, I often, somewhere along the way, have a lot of fun brainstorming titles. And so this one, I appreciate this title, and I hope you do too. It started as a play on Trump's 1980s book called The Art of the Deal. And so we kind of just wordsmithed that, and I have to give RJ credit for that. And then during the course of writing, I happened to look up a definition of the word spiel, and I'm just going to read that to you. It's not in the paper, but I think it's very telling for what we ended up finding. So, as defined, a long or fast speech or story, typically intended as a means of persuasion or as an excuse, regarded with skepticism or contempt by those who hear it. Right? And so I had never really thought of a formal definition of spiel, and going into this, we didn't come at the study, but that's ultimately a lot of what we found in the storytelling. So let's get started here. Let's see. So what I'm interested in, what my research is interested in, is on the structures and processes of how we communicate. And this can apply to anything. This can apply to gender norms, crime in the media, economic understanding, childhood education. You can extend this basic idea to all kinds of arenas. So as I said, this isn't really about Trump, even though he is the case study. His tweets are the case study. Some of the relevant concepts that some of you may know and some of you not, that I thought I would introduce would be things like social construction, which captures how we create and communicate meanings with one another. And when that happens over and over again in a patterned way, we can see rhetoric, which is styles of talk, which can involve content, tone, links between words and images and all those kinds of things. And then terms like frames and claims, which capture how we put all of that information into order to make it compelling, understandable, and persuasive, right? And so it directs our attention to things like, what are people saying? How are they saying it? Who's saying it and when? Who's listening and when? And from all that, this took me into a new area of research that I only knew a little bit, and it was the research on narratives and storytelling. So ultimately, as we began reading his tweets over and over again, you could start to see a story emerge that I didn't know was there when I was first encountering this. And so I know we have some students in the room and others interested in research, and it kind of captures the dynamic nature of research and how you don't know everything you're going to find before you go into it. You often don't know very much of it, and I think this study captures that. There's a general question here that we could all, I didn't put anything on the slide because I imagine the answers are there for you. What makes a good story, right? It's interesting. It's engaging on some level. It's mostly pretty clear and easy to follow. It's flexible enough to, add new information, but not so broad and unbounded that it gets kind of out of control. It often has a clear and coherent plot, kind of A plus B equals C, which can lead to really clear and simple solutions. And all of that's important because when real complex information, political information in this case, from political candidates, public officials, presidents, when their communication comes in story form, something often gets sacrificed in terms of accuracy, empirical evidence, and quality. The story, when you're telling a story, it's about the story, not so much about the evidence. And by the way, when I said what makes a good story, notice I didn't say anything about accurate, clear, empirical evidence. It's often not necessary, and in fact, it's often in the way of a good story, right? So I just wanted us to think about that in our general language and our general experience of how we share and encounter stories, the things that make stories compelling, and we can then shift that over to Trump's tweets, right? And as the title of the article talks about, we used a framework, not just a storytelling framework, but we drew on some literature on rhetoric and crime. And maybe many of you are familiar with Hunter S. Thompson's classic notion of gonzo journalism. And so all of that got fused together, and what we saw was a particular kind of storytelling. And the key thing with Thompson's gonzo is it's about putting the storyteller front and center in the story. This is about their perspective, their experience, their opinions, their ideologies. Compared to traditional journalism or something, right, where you're supposed to be a detached chronicler of information, just the facts, that kind of thing. And so it's a very different way of engaging with the world. And so we brought that into the storytelling perspective. And what it does, as we've defined it and drawn on the literature, is it highlights how the story is really a vehicle for conveying emotions and feelings, right? And there's a lot of literature to support how storytelling works that way. And in this case, the way we ended up defining this, and you can find this in the tweets, those emotions aren't that broad. They tend to be focused on what we're calling negative emotions. So lots of grievances, lots of outrage, lots of fear narratives and fear frames. So that I wanted to make it clear. And then the final thing that's really important here as you go through these tweets, and I'll show you the data in a minute, but we went through over 4,000 of his tweets repeatedly. And what struck me over time was how little actual supportive evidence was found in any of these, not links to reports, not links to studies, not even in the policy type tweets. So it suggests that this kind of storytelling is really about the emotion and really about telling the version of the world and the storyteller's place in that world that is advantageous to the story. And evidence isn't necessary, and it's often in the way. So you can kind of think of storytelling that way, gonzo storytelling. All right, so in terms of our data, right, we ended up looking at, this was going to be a bigger study when we first started, not realizing how many tweets we would encounter and how many times we'd have to read through them. We thought it would be interesting to see how his Twitter rhetoric changed from the various stages of his political career, from outsider candidate to kind of leading person to eventually the nominee into the office and all. But we put all that aside, And what we ended up with for this study was from the time he announced his candidacy until the time he officially accepted the nomination here in Cleveland. And after we pulled out tweets that were just links and some other things, we ended up with just under 4,000 tweets. And I won't kind of bore you with the coding details. I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A. But basically, you look for themes, patterns, words, those kinds of things as you read through whatever your text or video or whatever you're using. And you begin to see categories and patterns emerge. And then you see, how those fit together. And you just keep kind of going through it until it starts to make sense. You go back and forth with the literature. Anyways, to get all those tweets, we went to the Trump Twitter archive, which is still available. So he is no longer on Twitter, but his tweets are still preserved there. I just put some images on there. Hopefully you can see if they're a little bit small, but so you can see sort of what you can do there. So you can sort, you can, look for just tweets, just retweets, those kind of things. And then earlier today, I did a quick search for the word dummy. And so you can see that Trump's tweets included the word dummy, where we usually in a negative way about someone else, 83 times, right? And so you could just quickly search for things. So as themes start to emerge in your coding, you can go back and say, ooh, how often am I seeing this? So it was actually a really helpful tool. We ended up downloading them into Excel and did a lot of the analysis there. So anyways, I'll leave that for the methods for the Q&A if there are any questions. All right, let me take you through the study. So what we ended up finding is when you look through these 4,000 tweets, they were organized, ended up being organized predominantly around 6 core frames. And as we found these, they ended up being sort of building blocks of a larger story. So this is where the storytelling thing started to emerge. Some of these frames became clear from reading the tweets, but how they all fit together came over time into the story frame. And so what I want to highlight here, I'll go through each one in a moment with some examples. But what I wanted to highlight here is how common these were. You can see the number of tweets that we coded having that frame. Every one of these frames was found in at least 10% of the tweets. You can see the last two are nearly half or more than half of the tweets had these. And so they become significant parts of his story. And so as we get to those, keep that number in mind in terms of how large they are as an influence on this story. Okay. So the first one, and there's a lot of tweets, not all the slides are quite this busy, but I wanted to give you a sense of how this frame was being conveyed. And I chose examples around a consistent theme that emerged early in the campaign. It had to do with dangers of Mexico, right? And those dangers were about more than crime and more than drugs and violence. These ones are about that. But it was a central theme early on from, within days of announcing his candidacy. And as we saw this, and over time, and we go through this in the study, the dangers changed. They weren't always about Mexico and they weren't always about drugs. But a consistent theme throughout this story was the idea that we are facing all kinds of threats, serious threats that are looking to do you and your family or the sort of moral fabric of the country harm. And none of these were presented with evidence, research evidence, empirical evidence. You might be an anecdotal example, so like a drug dealer who was busted or something like that. But these threat culprit frames, they served as the foundation for the story. Everything else flows from these because they are the thing that is wrong that needs to be addressed, and ultimately in Trump's telling, only he can address them. You can think of how often you saw or heard "I alone" or "only Trump" kind of statements. And what they do is they provide a very emotional but simple and direct statement on a problem that can then build out other parts of the narrative, right? And that simplicity is key to making the story work, but it's what's most problematic to us as critical analysts, because all of these issues that are being portrayed as threats, whether it's crime, whether it's immigration, whether it's trade policy, these are incredibly complex things, and they get simplified to such a level that all of that complexity is stripped away. And so you can see that here in these. And then this last one I included, even though it's outside of our sample range, just to let you see how the story persisted well into, throughout the political career, this specific story of the dangers of Mexico. So with that in place, there's something wrong and someone's responsible. Someone is to blame. Someone or something is to blame. That becomes the central force of most of his storytelling, right? And from these, we get a lot of messages that someone else should have been doing something about this and was not. So you get a lot of emphasis on the failings of others. In this case, as a political candidate, that was almost all of them were focused on other politicians. And so as a constructed threat would emerge in the narrative, whether it's the Iran nuclear deal or crime or drugs, or more recently election security, someone is responsible for this threat, right? And what's important is this would become important to his outsider narrative, the idea that politicians are failing, endemically weak, those kinds of things. So as you can see from these tweets, they're kind of general statements or specific to different politicians, right? And the point I would make here is these perceived failings frames, they build from the threat culprit frames, but they also then provide kind of context for the other parts of this story that I'm about to go through with you. And so the third one that really emerged prominently was the idea that, okay, something is seriously wrong. We know who's responsible in this story, right? We know our politicians are too weak or, beholden to political interests or lobbyists or whatever, right? So you can, those of you who paid attention to his career can really see like the drain the swamp narratives emerge in these early stories, even though those phrasings weren't there. So with those first two frames in place, the notion that something has to be done really takes hold. And it's not just any something, it tends to be extreme, often constitutionally dubious ideas about what should be done. And through this narrative, those things, because it's so consistent and told so frequently, those extreme things seem like, yeah, of course we would do that. Of course we would storm the Capitol. Of course we would, build posses in Arizona and use those to round up the people that don't have documented citizenship, those kinds of things. And you see a lot of the rhetoric that we identified that first helped this approach crystallize was things like get tough and fight back. And so you can see some of that notions of strength and those kinds of things. All right. The fourth one, and I'm trying to go fast, and I hope it's still clear, because I didn't want to get bogged down in the details too much. But this is where, in a lot of Trump's tweets, and this was a prominent theme, where a lot of his tweets are about how great he is, right? And that shouldn't be surprising. It's a pretty obvious theme. But within this story, we thought it was important because while the first three are about making the story compelling and sort of important and relatable to his audience, this is about building up the storyteller, right? And it highlights the interconnection between, look, we go back to what makes a good story. Part of it is who's telling it and in what context, right? And so if you find favor in a storyteller, you're going to find their stories more believable. And if you don't know the storyteller that well, the story has to be really compelling for you to buy into the storyteller. So there's an intersection between those two that we thought was important from reading the narratives literature. And you could see that in his tweets in these self-adulation frames. About his business acumen, his skill in various areas, and those sorts of things. And his strength and stamina became a big focus. All right, the fifth of the sixth is, and I'll just be quick here, it was basically retweeting. And you'll remember, this was almost 50% of the tweets in the sample had this in there. So this was a central theme. And it was about retweeting or showing evidence that others thinks he's great. So he's spent, if you think about substitute approaches, it's like, I've got the solutions and only I am willing to do them. Like everybody else is too weak. So that's one source of appeal. Another one is I'm pretty great and let me show you how. And yet another one that sort of builds on that is look how great everyone else thinks I am. There's standing room only for my appearances. He'll pictures with celebrities. Here it is with Bobby Knight, the famed Indiana basketball coach during an appearance in Indiana. Crowd sizes at different events. Look at my television ratings. So a lot of the stuff that sort of existed in his former life in terms of getting into the tabloids and having ratings from The Apprentice, those translated into how he was viewing his political effectiveness and success in our reading of this. And there were so many, since it was about 50% of the tweets, we ended up creating subframes to organize the popular appeal stuff to kind of understand the patterns within that. And so that's what that table on the right is. It had to do with how many tweets were about someone else saying something positive about him. And so we called that positive punditry. And then the others were references to his strong poll numbers, or his great crowd sizes, or his television ratings even. So all of those serve to build up both. And what's interesting about this one is it builds up the story. Look how everyone loves my story and buys it, right? And the storyteller. So going back to what I was saying about how those two tie together, popular appeal could support both of those. And then finally, we know his views, his ideas, his approaches were not popular. They got a lot of critical pushback, starting with that Mexicans as druggies, drug dealers, and rapists from early in the campaign. But one of the effective rhetorical strategies that would later emerge as fake news, but we didn't have any fake news in this sample as a phrasing, was the idea of undercutting critics by calling into question their ability to even offer criticism, or trying to do something to suggest that they were worse at whatever it is they were charging him as. Or it was also as kind of simplistic as nicknames and juvenile nicknames and taunts, right? So again, a couple of examples, but this was the most common feature of his nearly 4,000 tweets that we found, that we looked at. I think it was something like 58% in that earlier table. So this was a significant feature of his storytelling, and it was about delegitimizing others. And we go into quite a bit in the paper about what this means and why they do it. But what it basically meant was, even as people were challenging his story that didn't have evidence, that was outlandish in some of its claims, that was extremes in some of its strategies and proposals, he was able to undercut that criticism with a variety of rhetorical techniques. And so that's what this was designed to capture. And down the bottom, I just put some of the more common nicknames, some of the greatest hits from back in 2015 and 2016. Okay, and then the last point I want to make, and this is something that we spend a couple of pages on in the paper, and it ties us back in to what our larger theme and some of what Lauren said is, there's a difference between shouting things in social media and it finding its way to a broad audience. And I think Trump's story helps illustrate that. This story is extreme. Yes, it's compelling. Yes, a lot of people believed it, but a lot of people would not have heard it without media attention. And so when we talked about media validation, we don't mean support. In fact, as there's a bunch of research we cite in the paper, as his campaign went on, more and more people found problems with what he was saying and challenged it. But ultimately what we found was, it fit the adage of any publicity is good publicity. And so any publicity of his statements and his rhetoric served to kind of validate the story he was telling and spread its reach. And so if people liked it, great, I'm doing a good job. If people didn't like it, well, they're part of the problem and they don't want you to know this truth or whatever it is, right? So the misinformation was strengthened by media coverage. And I have a couple of findings from other research studies, not ours. For instance, look how few people actually see Trump's tweets sort of in the wild in Twitter, right? Yet another study from 2020 found that 72% of respondents encountered his tweets through some sort of secondary media source, most often cable and broadcast news. And so that becomes important as we understand not only how misinformation takes shape and sort of finds its form in social media, which is what this study is about, but as it spreads out into the broader media ecosystem, right? We have to understand how these parts fit together. And I think that's an area for future consideration as well. And then with that in mind, we want to just think about, and we talked a little bit about this in the paper, and I thought the Q&A could work for this as well. We want to think more broadly, as Lauren has, about social media and political communication and sort of how it's changing and opportunities. There are good things about it and challenges it could present. Specific to this study and others who are interested in Trump's storytelling approach, we want to understand the importance of storytelling in what other scholars have called a post-fact world, where information accuracy is a real challenge. And in many ways, this is an ideal environment for storytelling, which is emotion forward, not reliant on fact. And so we want to be looking for that and maybe understanding how to challenge it and bring evidence back into the conversation. And then, of course, what most people have wanted to talk about since this study got published, and of course, the timing was it was published, within days of the assault on the Capitol. Lots of people have wanted to talk about what will happen now that Trump's Twitter ban takes place. And so I think we want to explore that and how this story is shaping party politics, which probably brings it back into Lauren's area more than mine. So anyways, I hope I didn't take too long, but that's sort of the study and sort of how it connects to what I've been doing and maybe how we can think about it going forward. And so I would love to have a little dialogue about that with everyone.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And I'm going to go ahead and bring us all back together. So I don't know if anybody has any questions right off the bat, or Dr. Copeland, if you have anything you want to kind of add on to the framing that Dr. Monahan has provided.
I had a conclusion slide, but I don't feel it's necessary.
Okay, sure. So I'll wait a second. And anybody, feel free if you want to unmute and ask a question, or if you'd prefer to put it in the chat box, we can kind of navigate from there as well.
Can I ask a question?
Go ahead, Chuck. Absolutely.
Okay. As a librarian, this sort of topic is very near and dear to our profession, and information literacy and all that. I find these analytical understandings and frameworks, compelling and interesting. But I'm always kind of grounded in where the rubber hits the road. What can be done to counteract these things? It's fine to understand how it is that a politician uses social media or uses various tactics or framings to demonize others, or diminutive nicknames and stuff. But what is the defense of this? What is, besides trying to say, well, we should have more workshops or more liberal arts education? I mean, I agree all these things are good, but when you're dealing with a mass phenomenon like that, it just doesn't seem like it's enough.
Well, I'll take the first shot at that. It's a great question, Chuck. I think one of the things, and not to pander to the audience here, is to do what we're doing here at BW, which is the critical thinking, liberal arts education, and broadening some of those ideas. And hopefully what we're doing is teaching these students how to sort of spread that idea into the world and be critical thinking. I'm kind of being vague here, but as far as specific ways to do it you could think about ways to try to control the message on the front end, which is perhaps what the Twitter ban is trying to do. And I don't know how effective that is. You can try to do some of the strategies of information literacy that Lauren talked a little bit about there. But I think one of the things is making more critically engaged consumers on the back end when this information is out there and they are receiving it. To me, that is one of the areas that we can effectively target, or try to anyways.
I'll jump in. So there are more and more organizations and nonprofits devoted to rating news media and blogs, both from the liberal to conservative spectrum, but also from complete opinion to actual facts. So Vanessa Otero's media bias 6.0 chart comes to mind. There's also, I'm trying to think of the name, something side that tells you whether stuff is accurate. I thought that when the facts about the election were being challenged, I thought it was good that Twitter started finally flagging Trump's tweets and others' tweets as saying, this tweet may contain inaccurate information. The problem is that if you already think that Trump is a credible source, or at least that he tells it like it is, then those flags aren't going to work because you're engaging in motivated reasoning, even if you don't know you're doing so. So there are some organizations out there working to fight it, and social media companies, they're kind of in a bind because they don't want to regulate speech and make people angry because they need people on the platform in order to make money. But yeah, I don't think they've quite figured it out yet.
Well, and I think one thing that we heard last week from Dr. Kuyper's talk was that, especially when you're thinking about some of these more white supremacist movements and things like that, they're not just appealing to people's minds and sense of intellect, they're really appealing to people's hearts and providing a sense of us versus them, and you're really a part of something here. And I see a bit of that in some of what, Brian, your work has shown here too, in that storytelling aspect of creating the story and inviting people in. So that's very interesting. We have some more questions here in the chat. One is how active can and should companies, and this is you touched on this a bit, so I don't know if there's more you'd like to say, but should companies like Facebook be in fact checking and censoring?
I mean, that would be great, but ultimately their goal is to make money. And if we're not paying to use the service, then we're the products. So I just don't see it happening. Should they? Do they have an obligation? Maybe. I don't know.
Brian, there's some curiosity here if you're going to continue to analyze Gonzo tweets leading up to the insurrection, or do you think the processes and structures are the same?
All right, Jill, only if you'll be my co-author. It's a lot of work reading through those tweets. So one of the things that we're interested in, because one of the things that happened with the election more recently, and then the post-election, including the election fraud and the Capitol stuff, you could see the problem is, as a researcher, it's very hard to find meaningful conclusions from an N of one. We have one candidate who has done these things in a compelling and successful way so far that we've identified. And so it can be tricky to know, but one of the things we can see is maybe, did we reach the outer limits of how far this story can take you in terms of not winning the election, in terms of losing repeatedly in court when challenging these claims, right? So the story in a storytelling world can be one thing, but when it's brought into the legal world where you have to provide evidence and you can't make false claims in the legal arena, did we find the outer limits of this kind of storytelling? That's something RJ and I have actually talked about. And he wants to call it Stop the Spiel, noticing this, Stop the Steal Splay. So he's playing around with the title already, right? But yeah, I think, and do I think it would be more of the same? Maybe, but it's hard to know because one of the things that you had in the period we're looking at is this is a political outsider, right? And a key part, I didn't make a big deal out of it in today's talk, but in the paper, we look at how that outsider status was such an important part of selling these frames that we've identified. And 4 years later, the incumbent, maybe that rhetoric isn't available or isn't as effective. So I think you could compare then and now, but it's still one candidate and there's so many other variables that could be affecting it. Anyways, I was just trying to riff on and think about that with you as a group here. So I'm sorry I don't have a coherent fixed answer for that.
The next question from Christy is a question about internet regulations. I know Facebook is advertising for internet regulations. Regulations have not been passed since 1996. What would that mean? Would that help, or is it just Facebook trying to get more attention?
I don't know what advertising for internet regulations. What regulations are they advertising for?
Christy, do you want to clarify?
Sure, I apologize. I've seen just commercials go to this website, facebook.com regulations, and the little bit that I read on it just said they're asking for internet regulations because they haven't been passed since 1996. And I'm just curious if they think they're just throwing their hat into the ring to be relevant after everything that has happened recently. And it's really just in their best interest to put this out there like they want regulations to be passed, when really it's just going to help them bolster more attention to themselves and more members.
Yeah, I don't know anything about it, so I just can't say.
Not specific to the Facebook or others, but one of the things we could think about is how monetized this kind of communication is. In the media environment, from a financial standpoint, there is not a lot of reason to try to be accurate and evidence-based. And so one thing that some scholars have talked about is trying to challenge or reassert certain standards in what counts as news and journalism and those kinds of things. Maybe calling into question tax exempt status or other things that could change the financial landscape, but make it less profitable to engage in certain kinds of communication. And that may apply to social media too, but that's not a world, like, I don't understand. I haven't read much about those regulations enough to speak to it.
Kelly, I'm gonna sum up your question here, but I would love if you want to just jump into, because I think it's a great point here. So Kelly's identifying that yes, there's something really unique about Trump's style, but some of these themes, Brian, that you've pulled out from your research, such as kind of a threat and a culprit, aren't these themes that we see just in general political discourse? Is it really that unique? And again, Kelly, I would love if you want to jump in.
Yeah, thanks, Christy. I appreciate it. And I agree that it is unique. I don't mean to, I mean, clearly, and I think, Brian, your research has really identified sort of the kind of unique dimensions of Trump's discourse. But many of those elements certainly are sort of, I mean, of course, they're common to sort of populist and demagogue style discourse. But even beyond that, a lot of this is just politics. Not all of it. I think some of it is distinctively Trump, but lots of it is, you know, you could translate a lot of that to Bernie Sanders, a lot of these, not all of them. There are stylistic differences, of course, when we look to other political movements, and it's not just politicians, but political movements, right? Going back to some of the social media movements that Lauren was describing, how truth beholden are the various claims that power a lot of social movements that we ourselves are very sympathetic to. You know, in other words, how much is this post-truth? I mean, it's easier for us who tend to be a little less on the side of the political side of Trump to it's sort of patently clear what's, although it's useful to get the analysis, it's also patently clear to most of us that there's something deeply wrong about Trump's you know, post-truthism. But how vulnerable are we ourselves to these kinds of narrative styles, you know, when they match better with our own political commitments? And I guess I know that's not, there's no simple way to answer that kind of question, but that intrigues me a lot, is how much are we progressives sometimes? I mean, you can catch us here and there with our own fake news things and things like that. You know, you can find these things, but you know, does a PhD inoculate us from fake news, for example, right? Those kinds of things.
So fantastic points, Kelly. And then tying that together with what Lauren was talking about with sort of the siloing and where you get your information and shared viewpoints and kind of preconceived ideas come back at you. If you hear a story, if you want to tie it back to my storytelling thing, if you hear a story often enough and it's consistent enough, it goes from a way to see things to the way to see things, right? And I don't think that is at all unique to Trump or his supporters or anybody at either end of the political spectrum in terms of just basic communication. If you are exposed to very few viewpoints, especially those that challenge you, and in a patterned way where you just don't get outside of your bubble will become the way the world works and the way to understand the world. And that's a concern to, you know, as a social scientist, that's a concern for me. So I think you make a great point about how to extend this out into more broad arenas or different audiences or different case studies. And I hope people will do that, even if it's not me.
And if you'd like to do more thinking with Dr. Coble, you can join our session next week. I'll just put that plug in there. Jill, I saw you unmuted. I don't know if you have a comment. Christy, Jill did provide some insight into regulations in the chat box. And there is a question here about this idea of the permanent bans that Twitter has enacted. And are those actually a common thing? Do you believe it's a dangerous precedent?
I think it's really, really rare that that happens, and that might be unprecedented. It's a little bit suspect because it can be a slippery slope in terms of whose ideas they censor. Like if you are more liberally inclined and you think that Trump is mostly not telling the truth most of the time, then it's a great thing that Twitter banned his account. But the communication just shifts then to another platform. So I forget the right-wing platform that sprung up after he was banned from Twitter, but he's still finding ways to communicate to people. It's just not through Twitter. It's a really slippery slope. I don't know. Ryan, what do you think?
So, as somebody who read a lot of his early communication and paid attention closely thereafter, he didn't really say anything in those last couple of weeks before the ban that was all that different from what he had been saying before. And so, one, that highlights the importance of context in story, right? Storytelling. But I think it also suggests this stuff is very rare. And then going back to an earlier point that made me think of it again is, if we could think of ways to understand and assess in real time, which is super pie in the sky stuff, but if we could think of ways to understand accuracy and quality of information and sort of flag that, one of my problems with as I was doing this research and paying attention to all the fact checking that the Washington Post had a Pinocchio index, they still do, but they were applying it to Trump and others. And with this kind of storytelling that we ended up identifying, that was useless, because that presupposes that the lies are there and trying to sneak past us. These weren't. The lying was not a bug. It was a feature, right? Accuracy wasn't designed to be part of this story as it was told. And so if we could find ways to identify, that's why your point about Twitter flagging potentially false or flawed information could be useful. I don't know if that's an effective mechanism long-term with all the communication, but that maybe is something. So anyways, I don't know that bans are the solution, and nor are they particularly effective. And they kind of reinforce the narrative that was in place already too, which is interesting.
Thank you. And go ahead, Sarah. I see you have your hand up there.
Thank you. Sorry, my question is a little too long to kind of type, and it's a lot to explain. But so if we are trying to, I guess, like stop misinformation, it's kind of necessary to have that other side, if we want to think of it like on two sides and then a scale, right? And then there are more clicks kind of going from there. But how do I, as the user, and like potentially me as a teacher, because I want to go on and teach, and I'd be teaching research and how to effectively like find the right information. We just have to categorize it a little more. I'm just trying to make sure that I'm understanding. I hope that's a good question. I hope you guys understand what I mean.
Can you repeat the question again?
Yes, of course. So I guess we need, the question is essentially, is that how do I, as a user, kind of stop the spread of misinformation if I see misinformation, or is that even an effective way to do it? I don't know if that's even a question that you guys can answer. I'm just throwing things out just for the sake.
You can flag things on social media, but I wouldn't necessarily I wouldn't say it's a good use of your time to call out people or to say like, hey, check Snopes.com because this isn't true. Unless it's like a relative or someone you're friends with, like, hey, you better check this out because of motivated reasoning and this tendency to believe what you want to believe is true, which is just kind of an unfortunate thing. And I think that our politics have become so much more polarized over the past 4 years that wall and that opportunity for civil discourse is even, but the opportunity just isn't there like it used to be. So there is the flagging of information, and the companies will possibly remove it. But I don't know. I'm not too optimistic about our ability to stop the spread of misinformation and disinformation, to be honest.
Z, it's a great question, and it kind of captures the dynamic that this conversation has taken, which is how can we get better information, or how can we get better at consuming information, which are two fundamentally different questions, and each would then have the sub-question of, all right, whose responsibility is that? Is it the companies? Is it the consumer? Is it someone in between? And so as a teacher, the thing that you would seem to have the most control over is teaching techniques for information consumption, right? As politicians or public leaders or people in the media industry, maybe those are the people that could be tasked, should they be inclined to do so, with how do we get better information. So it's, I would say tackle what you can. And I've had you in class, we've worked together, you're amazing, and I know you'll teach great things, and sort of just focus on what you think you can do to kind of address this at that level. And I think the consumption of information is probably where you can make a difference.
It's a great question. Dr. Krutke, I'm so glad to see you here, and I see you have your hand up. I think you're muted. I think you're good now.
Our connections aren't always good in the Valley. Can you hear me?
Yep.
The thought that runs through my mind, especially with Brian's presentation, is thinking back to the 1800s and the rise of yellow journalism, when newspapers had no standards, reporters wrote all sorts of things, and people made of it what they would. I think, going back to social construction theory, there's a mix of us as recipients of the news and those who make it beginning to work through some standards for this new kind of communication that we just haven't gotten. I think we're in the pioneer days. It behooves us, as the student was pointing out, as important listeners, to challenge some of the things we hear and to make it clear that we're not satisfied with things that aren't checked or verified, or, you decide who you're going to listen to and who you'll pay attention to. But I think it's the Wild West days in terms of this new technology, and it's got to be, maybe civilized is the word, a little bit more, but it's going to take popular reaction, I think, to put that in place, or at least to start concern with it.
Judy, what brought about that change, given the example you gave to start, the historic example in the newspapers?
Well, I'm not a student of journalism, but as I understand it, I think it was popular dissatisfaction with misinformation. It was the purveyors of the information that began to recognize that they had a responsibility to deliver facts, and we had schools of journalism. I don't teach communications, but the interplay of communications and the role of communications, it might be someplace too that faculty could have an impact on what's going on. But there needs to be popular dissatisfaction with so much disinformation, or at least attempts, and reporters aren't always accurate, but attempts to be objective and to get to the extent that they can to the truth. I mean, think about the newspaper. You've got news reporting in some sections, and you've got editorials in other sections. And the facts go in the news articles theoretically, and the opinions go on the editorial pages. And if you want to brag about yourself, you write a letter to the editor. So I think maybe there's some parallels in terms of spread of information, but as newer means of dissemination of information, it's still early in terms of how it's going to develop and what those standards are going to be, and probably who's going to set them.
Thank you so much. I want to be mindful of our time. This is a great conversation. No, it's wonderful. It's a great point. And, it makes me think more, especially for some of the students who are commenting here and things, what's happening on campus? How are we talking about this? What is the narrative amongst students related to this, especially as we were going through the political process in the fall? Julie, who you're going to hear from in a minute, leads our democratic engagement strategies on campus with Jackets Engaged. And so there may be opportunities here if there's students who are interested in thinking about what this looks like on campus and how do we bring about some of this awareness and continue the conversation, certainly reach out. We'd be happy to continue exploring what this could look like. So, but I'm going to turn it over to Julie now.
There we go. I was can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, it was still saying I was muted, so I apologize for that. So thank you to Dr. Copeland and Dr. Monahan for a very important, enlightening presentation, and to all of you for attending. As we've mentioned a number of times at the beginning and end of these presentations, like, this is not meant to be the end of a discussion. This is something that is ongoing, and a lot of really big questions were raised here today. And we would love if you share any ideas you all have for how we can continue to move the conversation forward. Are there other speakers? Is there some other format? Definitely do encourage you to attend our next presentation, which is by Dr. Kelly Coble, who's here today in the Department of Philosophy, on preventing truth decay, why disinformation is winning hearts and minds, and what we can do about it. So we can look forward to that next Monday at 4 p.m. And again, please, if you have suggestions of additional topics or ways to move these topics forward, we are always open to those. Thank you again for attending, and have a wonderful evening.
Oh, I have a question.
Thanks, Julie, and thanks, everyone. Yeah, we'll hang out for a minute if anybody else has additional questions or anything.
Thank you. I missed the white supremacy talk, and I kind of wanted to be there. How do I get access to the recording?
Yeah, absolutely. It is. I'll post it here. It's available on our YouTube channel, and even easier, you can just go to this website, and there's a list of all the I think there's 16 or 17 sessions at this point. So you can find all of them there with a link to the recording and all the resources that the presenters have shared. So
awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you for being here. It was really nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
Thanks, Brian. Really interesting stuff, and so well framed. I think, yeah, it was really well done. So
thanks for making time and including me. Let me know what else you need.
I will.
You got that in a short period of time.
Yeah.
And it really clearly, I thought.
Oh, thank you. You never know. On this side, it always feels jumbled, but thank you. That's helpful.
No, it was very, I really appreciated the way you explained things. Did Lauren jump off already?
I think so. Yeah, she's got her kids.
I'm sure everyone else does as well.
All right. Thanks.